Justice C. Thomas didn't bother to look up when Denzel Washington stepped into the courtroom. He shuffled a stack of papers with slow, theatrical contempt, making it clear. Denzel wasn't welcome here. The case was significant, a high-profile ethics violation involving millions in misappropriated public funds. But Justice Thomas treated it like a tedious distraction. When he finally spoke, his voice dripped with venom-laced sarcasm. "Mr. Washington," he sneered, "I trust you've brought something more substantial than your reputation today. Or should we skip straight to the part where you waste my time?" Chuckles echoed from the defense table. Denzel remained motionless, calm, focused, not a single muscle twitched. Because what Justice Thomas didn't know was that Denzel wasn't just here to present a case. He was here to pull the veil off an empire. In his briefcase was a file. Inside it, a truth. And behind that truth, a revelation powerful enough to end the career of the man presiding from the bench. Justice Thomas thought this hearing was about a flawed budget report. He had no idea Denzel had already uncovered something deeper, more damning. In mere moments, Denzel Washington would no longer be the one standing trial. Clarence Thomas would. And when that moment arrived, no gavel, no robe, no title would shield him. "If you still believe the truth matters," the narrator's voice whispers, "stay with us, because justice is about to flip the script." Denzel approached the plaintiff's table with a calm, steady gait and eyes like sharpened steel. The air in the courtroom thickened, pregnant with anticipation. He opened the folder slowly, deliberately, unfolding the first exhibit, a set of financial documents outlining major discrepancies in the public funding allocated to a development project spearheaded by billionaire contractor Charles Lawson. He had just inhaled to speak when Justice Thomas cut in. "Mr. Washington," the judge said, exasperated, "do you always insist on drowning us in paperwork? Or is that your way of avoiding a point?" Laughter stirred again, but Denzel didn't blink. He simply exhaled and said with quiet resolve, "Your Honor, this exhibit clearly shows the approved public funding was $2 million. However, the internal ledger obtained via subpoena records a deposit nearing $4 million, twice the allocated budget." Justice Thomas leaned back, folding his arms. "So you're accusing the defendant of conjuring money from thin air? That's your smoking gun?" "No, Your Honor," Denzel replied, his voice smooth and unwavering. "This," he clicked a remote and turned toward the projection screen, "is the smoking gun." An enlarged copy of the disbursement form appeared on the screen. At the bottom, a signature, handwritten, in unmistakable black ink. C. Thomas. The room went still. Justice Thomas narrowed his eyes. "That document is inadmissible." Denzel stood quietly for a moment, then answered, "With respect, Your Honor, the document was obtained legally through a subpoena and verified through chain of custody. The court clerk has confirmed its authenticity." "I said," Thomas barked, louder now, "it's inadmissible." His voice echoed like a gunshot, but it couldn't drown out the unease rippling through the room. The gallery shifted. Reporters paused mid-sentence. A juror uncrossed her arms and leaned forward. Everyone had seen the document. Everyone had seen the name. Denzel didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "On what legal grounds, Your Honor?" he asked calmly. Thomas slammed the gavel. "Because I said so." The wood cracked like thunder, but the rising murmur in the courtroom wasn't so easily silenced. Denzel remained steady. "This is a public hearing. The document is factual, signed by you, and directly tied to a $2 million discrepancy in taxpayer money. The people have the right to know." Justice Thomas leaned forward, jaw clenched. "You're walking a dangerous line, Mr. Washington." Denzel met his stare and held it. "So are you. So are you." That's when the room changed. It wasn't loud. It wasn't sudden. But something shifted. The atmosphere tightened, not with case, but with the sharp precision of truth being unsheathed. The spectators weren't just watching a case unfold anymore. They were witnessing something unravel. Justice Thomas had drawn a line, and Denzel Washington had just crossed it, calmly, deliberately, with irrefutable evidence in hand. This wasn't just legal now. It was personal. The fuse was lit. Justice Thomas, visibly rattled, tried to retake control by sheer force of presence. His voice grew harsher with every objection, every denial. "Mr. Washington," he snapped, eyes narrowing, "this courtroom is not your personal stage. Stick to the facts or I'll hold you in contempt." Denzel didn't blink. His hand rested gently on another folder, one he had saved for exactly this moment. "Your Honor," he said, voice like iron wrapped in velvet, "I'd like to play a short audio clip. It directly concerns the admissibility of the earlier exhibit." Thomas scoffed and waved him off with a flick of the hand. "Play it. Let's waste more time." Denzel pressed the button on a small recorder. The soft hiss of static filled the courtroom. And then a voice emerged, low, gravelly, and chillingly familiar. "Take care of it. I don't care how. Make sure she never sees those ledgers." The gallery froze. Pens stopped mid-stroke. A reporter's mouth fell open. A juror leaned forward in disbelief. Justice Thomas didn't move, but the color drained from his face. Denzel didn't raise his voice. He simply said, with unwavering calm, "That voice belongs to Justice Clarence Thomas." A soft gasp came from the jury box. Even the defense table had gone still. Denzel let the silence linger, let the weight of the moment settle like a stone in run. Then he reached into his folder once more. "In addition," he continued, "I have a transcript from a federally authorized wiretap that corroborates this recording." He handed it to the bailiff, who delivered it to the bench. Thomas didn't reach for it. His hands were locked together, knuckles white. Denzel's voice was steady as he quoted aloud, "We'll take care of her. She doesn't have anything solid yet, but if she does, I'll make sure it never sees the inside of a courtroom." A ripple passed through the room. A camera shutter clicked. A journalist muttered, "Oh my God." The courtroom was no longer a venue. It was now a crucible. Justice Thomas suddenly stood up, his chair scraping loudly. "That audio is inadmissible," Biddy barked. "It's irrelevant and most likely fabricated." Denzel's face didn't change. "The wiretap was authorized by federal prosecutors, Your Honor. This isn't theater. This is obstruction of justice." Thomas pointed a trembling finger at him. "I'll have you removed from this courtroom." Denzel took a step forward. His tone remained composed but unshakable. "And I'll file for immediate judicial review." For the first time, Justice Thomas looked unsure. His voice faltered. I don't know where you got that." Denzel tilted his head slightly. "But you recognize it," he said softly. "Which is why the court must now review the next exhibit, one that directly implicates your financial interests in Mr. and Mr. Lawson's development firms." Thomas sank slowly back into his chair. He was trying to collect himself, but the room had already moved on. The jury leaned in, the bailiff's jaw was clenched. The defense team whispered with urgency behind cupped hands. Even Charles Lawson, seated behind his attorneys, looked pale, as if he'd seen a ghost. And Denzel Washington stood quietly in the center of it all, calm, unyielding. The truth standing tall in a place where power had once felt untouchable. Denzel opened another file, his hand steady and deliberate. "This," he said, placing the document under the display camera, "is a wire transfer from a shell corporation connected to the Lawson Group. It was routed to an offshore account in the Caymans." He clicked to the next slide. "The recipient," he continued, "is listed under a pseudonym, but when cross-referenced with state-level financial disclosures, that pseudonym matches a travel and legal expense fund used exclusively by Justice Clarence Thomas." A sharp, audible gasp swept through the courtroom. Even the court reporter, long trained to remain expressionless, looked momentarily stunned. Denzel didn't need to raise his voice. The truth was already speaking louder than any outburst ever could. "Your Honor," he said, his tone low and unwavering, "the evidence is overwhelming. I recommend you recuse yourself immediately or prepare to face the full weight of a federal indictment." The silence that followed wasn't just shock, it was realization. The courtroom had just seen a man unmasked, and they weren't looking at a judge anymore. They were looking at a defendant. Denzel didn't move. He didn't blink. He didn't back down. The only sound was the hum of the overhead projector and the furious scribbling of reporters catching up to history. Justice Thomas had been hit with a trifecta, A voice recording, a federally authorized wiretap, and a financial trail leading straight to his name. And Denzel wasn't done. He lifted one final folder. "Your Honor," he said, "this document details a series of expedited zoning permits and bloated municipal contracts, all of which were pushed through your chambers." He slid the next chart into the camera feed, a web of shell corporations, fake consultancies, and international accounts. These contracts directly benefited firms tied to Charles Lawson, he explained. And in turn, those firms funneled untraceable consulting fees into accounts controlled by you. At the bottom of every transaction chain, a familiar signature. C. Thomas. Justice Thomas slammed the gavel down with fury. "Enough! This is slanderous speculation, and I won't allow—" But Denzel cut through the tirade with a calm that silenced the room. "These files," he said evenly, "were obtained from the Federal Ethics Commission and verified by the State Financial Crimes Task Force." The gallery gasped. A juror covered her mouth, the air tilted, not from noise but from balance finally shifting. Justice Thomas stood, enraged, his voice hoarse. "I won't let this circus continue. Mr. Washington, you are in direct violation of—" He never finished the sentence. From the back of the room, a door opened. 3 agents in dark suits entered, purposeful and silent. The lead officer stepped forward and spoke with absolute clarity. "Justice Clarence Thomas," he announced, "you are under arrest for obstruction of justice, conspiracy to commit fraud, and abuse of judicial power." The gavel slipped from Thomas's hand. It hit the floor, bounced once, then spun to a dead stop. Gasps broke loose from the crowd. Phones came up. The jury stared in frozen disbelief. No, this is outrageous," Thomas shouted, backing up, hands raised. "I am the presiding judge of this courtroom. I am the law here." One agent stepped forward, cuffs in hand. "Not anymore." Denzel remained still. No gloating, no smile. He simply watched, calm, composed, as the man who had tried to belittle him was led down from the bench like any other criminal. The click of the handcuffs echoed through the room like thunder. Clarence Thomas, once feared, once untouchable, now stood as the accused, being read his rights. The gallery remained frozen. Even Lawson's defense team looked as though the floor had disappeared beneath them. And Denzel Washington? He just stood in the truth. Still, unmoving, letting justice echo for itself. Charles Lawson, seated behind his legal team, gripped the edge of the defense table with white knuckles. His once smug demeanor had vanished. The man who had spent most of the trial wearing a faint, superior smile now looked pale and shaken. His protector, his shield and robes, had just been led away in handcuffs. Denzel Washington took a quiet breath, letting the weight of the moment settle across the room. He hadn't come for revenge. He had come for restoration. A courtroom is supposed to be sacred ground, not a playground for the powerful. As Justice Clarence Thomas passed by, now cuffed and hollow-eyed, he glanced toward Denzel. The sharpness in his gaze was gone, replaced by fear, confusion, and disbelief. "You'll regret this," he muttered, almost pleading. Denzel met his eyes. "Justice doesn't regret," he said quietly. The heavy courtroom doors closed behind the former judge, and with that, the bench he once commanded stood vacant, a monument to fallen power. But the story wasn't over. Denzel turned, his eyes locked on Charles Lawson, who now shifted uncomfortably in his seat, sweat gathering at his temples. The room had turned on him. His immunity had just walked out in shackles, and Denzel wasn't finished. "Mr. Lawson," he said, voice even and deliberate, "your judge may be gone, but your accountability is not." Lawson opened his mouth, then shut it again. No defiance left. The courtroom itself felt like it was holding its breath. "Would you like to speak now?" Denzel asked. "Or wait until your name appears in the next round of indictments?" Lawson turned slowly toward his attorney, who suddenly looked like he'd aged a decade in 10 minutes. No one said a word. Denzel's tone never wavered. He didn't need to shout. His presence filled the room. "The corruption runs deep," he said, "and the people deserve to know how deep, so I'll ask again. Are you ready to cooperate?" The courtroom was transfixed. This wasn't just a trial anymore. This was history, and Denzel Washington had just flipped the system on its head. Within minutes of Justice Thomas being walked out in cuffs, the footage hit the internet. A freelance journalist seated near the back had recorded everything. The gasps, the silences, the moment Denzel stood unmoved while a titan of the bench fell. By the end of the hour, the clip had racked up over 2 million views. By morning, it was the top headline on every major news outlet across the country. Oh gosh. Justice with Denzel trended for 3 straight days. Commentators from all political backgrounds couldn't stop analyzing it. Legal experts broke down the confrontation frame by frame. Political podcasts replayed the second Denzel dropped the subpoenaed evidence. Memes flooded Twitter. Even late-night hosts tried turning it into satire, but couldn't deny the truth of what had unfolded. The arrest of a sitting Supreme Court justice was unprecedented. But it wasn't just the act, it was the man who made it happen. Denzel Washington became a household symbol, not just of resistance, but of integrity under fire. Older Americans who had watched the courts betray their ideals for decades felt hope return. Younger generations saw him as something rare, a figure who didn't posture or self-promote, but stood tall and let the truth speak. Even former skeptics called it a line in the sand. Politicians who once praised Thomas quietly scrubbed their endorsements. Law schools began dissecting the trial as a modern study in judicial integrity. But behind the headlines, something deeper had started to stir. And Denzel? He didn't stop with the arrest. He filed a formal ethics complaint with the State Judicial Review Board and kept pushing. But Denzel didn't stop there. He immediately called for the formation of an independent federal task force to investigate financial ties between judges, real estate developers, and city officials spanning multiple counties. Within a week, the governor's office issued a statement of support. Then, the emails began. Anonymous sources leaked damning documents, internal communications between Justice Clarence Thomas and high-ranking officials. The tone was clinical, detached, transactional. Judges discussed rulings like business deals. Denzel's name came up more than once. Washington is a problem we need to contain. Don't let him near the Lawson ledgers. If he does, we'll need to go higher up. That last line, go higher up, hit headlines like a lightning bolt. Speculation exploded. Who was higher up? Who else had a stake in silencing Denzel? Rumors swirled about federal figures, including whispers surrounding Senator Raymond Collins, a man whose campaign finance connections had long been shadowed by suspicion. Collins denied everything, but the public pressure mounted. Meanwhile, Denzel didn't take a victory lap. He didn't chase camera crews. He didn't pose for applause. Instead, he met quietly with investigative journalists. He reviewed each new leak with precision. He filed more paperwork, layer after layer, fortifying the legal case against the entire apparatus. In an interview with WNHT News, Denzel said simply, "This was never just about one corrupt judge. It's about a system that forgot who it was built to serve. We're just getting started." And the public listened. Thousands began showing up at city council meetings. Petitions spread like wildfire to audit municipal budgets. Whistleblowers emerged in county after county. The Department of Justice confirmed it had launched a formal inquiry based on evidence unearthed during the Washington proceedings. What started as a single courtroom collapse had become a national reckoning. But Denzel wasn't celebrating. He knew how power worked. He knew it never let go without a fight, and he could feel something else brewing. The deeper he dug, the more dangerous the silence above became. This wasn't the end. This was the threshold. The very next morning, Denzel Washington returned to the same courtroom where, just days earlier, a sitting justice had been arrested in disgrace. But this time, there was no sarcasm from the bench, no laughter from the defense table, no smirks or sideways glances meant to intimidate. Respect now filled the space where mockery once echoed. Charles Lawson, once untouchable, once smug, now sat visibly humbled. His suit was wrinkled. His hands twitched nervously as he flipped through notes with his attorneys. There was no more bravado, only fear. Denzel didn't gloat. He didn't need to. When the new presiding judge brought the courtroom to order, Lawson's attorney stood and requested to speak. The judge nodded. The lawyer turned to Denzel. "My client," he said carefully, "wishes to change his plea in exchange for full cooperation with federal and state authorities. A pause. He's prepared to provide evidence on multiple public officials he's worked with, including Justice Thomas. A ripple moved through the courtroom. Cameras clicked. Fingers flew over keyboards. Denzel remained still, then slowly rose. His voice was measured, steady, uncompromising. "I will support a reduced sentence," he said, "only if Mr. Lawson is willing to testify under oath, provide full financial records, and cooperate fully with ongoing investigations into municipal fraud, bribery, and judicial misconduct. No redactions, no omissions, total transparency." Lawson's lips parted. He swallowed, then finally nodded. "Yes," he said, his voice cracking. "I'll cooperate." A wave of cheers erupted from the public gallery. Reporters typed furiously. Cameras whirred. For the first time in years, the people of the city felt something rare. Justice. Not as a theory, but as a reality. Happening in real time. But Denzel wasn't finished. That evening, standing beneath the towering rotunda of Washington, D.C. City Hall, Denzel addressed a packed public forum on government transparency. The air was thick with purpose, not celebration. There was no political grandstanding, no victory lap, just a clear declaration of values. "There is no justice," Denzel said, his voice echoing through the marble chamber, "without accountability. And accountability starts with light, with truth, with transparency, and the courage to speak when it's easier to stay silent." The crowd erupted in applause. Many held candles aloft in symbolic unity. Others carried signs that read, "Justice is not for sale." Denzel showed us the way. That night, Denzel announced the launch of the Sentinel Initiative, a national watchdog network committed to tracking judicial rulings, political donations, and hidden contracts between public servants and private interests. Funded entirely by citizen donations and staffed by volunteer legal professionals, the Sentinel Initiative promised monthly accountability reports, a secure whistleblower tip line, and an independent research hub open to the public. Momentum surged. Universities pledged data analysis support. Retired federal judges volunteered as advisors. Citizens who had long felt powerless finally found their voice. A cultural shift had begun, one where silence would no longer shield the powerful. 3 days later, while combing through encrypted files from Lawson's evidence trove, Denzel's team uncovered a hidden folder that had gone undetected, buried beneath layers of obfuscation. It took hours to break. What they found chilled them. Bank transfers, offshore trusts, obscured account names, access codes, and a name repeated across document after document: Project Sentinel. Denzel stared at the screen. Thomas hadn't been the mastermind. He was a pawn, a gatekeeper. The corruption stretched far beyond the courthouse, beyond city lines, beyond state borders. This wasn't a scandal. This was a network, and now, with Clarence Thomas in custody and Charles Lawson cooperating, that network had just felt its first true fracture. Denzel didn't flinch. He leaned forward, eyes locked on the data, and whispered the words that had carried him through every courtroom ambush, every attack, every doubt. "This is only the beginning." The courthouse was quiet now. The cameras were gone. The press had dispersed. The crowd had thinned. Denzel Washington sat alone on the stone steps beneath the great columns, the same steps once climbed by men who believed they were untouchable. His briefcase rested at his side. The evening sun stretched long shadows across the plaza. His phone buzzed once. He looked down. An unknown number. One line: "You've made enemies." Denzel stared at it for a long moment. Then, slowly, he smiled. Not out of pride, not out of defiance, but because it meant the truth had landed where it hurt. Because corruption only panics when it's exposed. Because the silence of power had finally been broken. He typed back 3 words: "Build the next." Then he stood. No fanfare, no press conference, just quiet, unshakable resolve. As he walked away from the courthouse, he turned briefly toward a waiting camera, the only one left, his tone calm, his eyes steady. "If you still believe that one voice can bring justice, stay with us We're just getting started. And then the screen faded to black, with one final message: subscribe to Impact Stories, because the truth, no matter how long it's buried, will always rise.